This week's discussion is Not All Integrations Are Created Equal, and we are breaking down everything you need to know about technology integrations in fundraising with Max Friedman, Jeff Klein, and Matt Sorensen.
Thanks everyone for joining this discussion on Not All Integrations Are Created Equal, with a proliferating spectrum of fundraising and general solutions for nonprofits, understanding which will work together and how is critical. So I'm really excited to have all of you here today, and maybe we just go around and do quick introductions, starting with Max.
Thanks, Mitch. Excited to be here. My name is Max. I'm the founder and CEO of GiveButter. We're an online fundraising platform that works with nonprofits, student groups, sports teams, individuals, volunteers, helping with online fundraising campaigns, events, and donations online. So really happy to be here. Thanks, Mitch.
My name is Jeff Klein. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the LGBT Community Center in New York City. We're an organization that provides services to 6,000 different individuals a week who come to us for anything from direct services to arts and cultural programming or getting engaged in civic activism.
Hi, I'm Matt Sorensen. I'm the VP of Engineering and Product for Giving Compass. Giving Compass is a resource that is meant to allow people who are new to philanthropy to become educated and find different types of organizations and resources to help them become more involved and learn more about the philanthropic space.
Well, we have an all-star cast here today, so I'm really excited. And maybe Max, you could just start us off with the real basics and just help lay out, like, how do you think about a system or tool integration at the most baseline level? And then we'll go from there.
I love software and technology and its ability to impact people's lives at scale. Part of that, though, means that there's a trade-off. Do you build it? Do you buy it? Do you integrate with best-in-class tools, or do you work with something where everything's all in one place? And when thinking about an integration, there's a lot to consider in terms of how two tools can talk to each other. It can enable a lot of really incredible things, but it can also be a burden of time and upkeep for it. So there's a lot to consider. I'm excited to dive into the specifics, but that's sort of an intro to, I guess, the integrations considerations.
Matt, maybe if you could touch a little bit on what we hear terms like native integration, custom integration, and API, maybe just break some of those down for the less tech savvy listeners here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try. I guess my background is more on the engineering side, so my, I'm a little more familiar with more API integration. I think that we've definitely used a variety of different types of integration. Everything I call more just like client side, where it's code snippets that you're putting on a website, API key that you plug in to allow systems to communicate. Direct API integration is typically more involved and handled by developers. There's a lot of different types of APIs out there, but they generally all kind of function the same way. And I don't know if that covers kind of all the different scenarios you're talking about, but that's the areas that I'm the most familiar with.
Yeah, and that's helpful. And Jeff, just as someone that I know has implemented a lot of these things, when you hear we have an API available, I think for a lot of people that sounds like scary. They don't know what that means. Could you just explain, like, practically how you would work with that in your own systems?
Sure. So when we hear that an API is available for a system, we know it allows some degree of customizable interaction with that system for another system. So it tells us how to talk to it. We can build programming to create that interaction and hopefully make the data all sync.
Great. And Max, I know that you at GiveButter do a good job of bucketing things between what is native, custom, Zapier supported. Can you help define those different categorizations?
A native integration is where I'll start with. A native integration is one where you have it could also be called a first party integration. You have two tools that work together, that the integration itself is built in-house by those platforms. Meaning, let's say you have a fundraising platform and a CRM, and those two are different companies, they're different products. Having a native integration between those two tools allows for data to flow seamlessly without the need for a third-party tool to bridge them together. They can talk to each other directly And typically there's no code needed to enable the integration. You can log into one tool or the other, and the two can talk to each other. There's often configurable settings and things to make that possible. But there's no work or additional code required from the organization to integrate, aside from maybe adding an API key or something like that, which I'll touch on next. So the other option would be what I said was sort of having a third tool. There is like a third-party integration. Frequently, there's Zapier is referenced here, which is probably the most common third-party automation tool, where you take two different services who both integrate with Zapier or a third-party tool to then make that bridge happen. So you work with Zapier to make a CRM talk to the fundraising platform and vice versa. The last one would be an API integration, which allows the developers at an organization to integrate directly with the platform however they choose. So the API enables developers to make custom integrations to whatever specifications are available via the API. So you can build your own custom integration between a fundraising platform and a CRM instead of relying on a third-party tool or the native integration that was already built.
Sure. And Jeff, I know you've seen integrations work well and integrations not work so well. So what are some telltale signs of when you've seen something work out well, and the right questions you found to help spot any gaps in integration capabilities?
So I get the hard question. Okay, so we have dealt with a number of different integrations and a number of the different types that Max just mentioned. So when we're considering an integration and looking at it, we've certainly, I'd say, improved our evaluative criteria over the years, given all those experiences. And the reality is those different types that Max mentioned, whether it's an API that we hire someone to sort of custom build something to integrate with, or it's a primary or first party integration where they've sort of designed it to talk, the systems to talk to each other, that isn't the end of the evaluation. And in fact, that's just a way of categorizing them. We've had really amazing, robust first party integrations or primary integrations where the two products are designed to work together but allow immense customization. And we've had those types where they allow barely anything to happen. And we've actually had the same experience when working with just the sort of APIs directly and having developers get involved. So we often will ask questions around what exactly the data that's exposed is, what type of information, and how deep can we get with it? And then really trying to understand, especially with the primary integrations, what features or what type of business processes does it enable? And encouraging in a demo or any opportunity we have to explore that, to really have them be explicit and not just describe what theoretically is possible, but what it can do right out of the box.
And Matt, I know you've sat through a number of different vendor pitches or demos and onboarded a lot of different products. What have you found as good ways to get to the core of functionality when people are looking at things that integrate with one another?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the time what we try to do is just make sure we have a good understanding of the roadmap for the product, as much as that they're willing to disclose anyway, to try to understand where it's going. What kind of breakage could be introduced? Are we going to have to invest a lot of time in maintaining it or keeping up with the different versions? Do they properly version their API, for example? And just try to really understand the long-term cost associated with an integration. Fortunately, most modern best practices for development these days, APIs can be pretty stable, which is great. And so there's less risk there, but we always try to make sure we understand the risk that's introduced and just the total cost of the integration.
Could you just double click a bit on the versioning of the API? I just want to make sure audience understands specifically what you mean by that.
Yeah, we talked about APIs and how data is exchanged between multiple systems, but if one side or whoever is exposing the API may need to make changes to either the way the data is structured or the functionality, you have to make sure that you're not breaking people that have already integrated. So it's a good, like I said, best practice to version the API so that people aren't required to or are forced to update to your latest API version, and then have a plan for how long that's supported so that there's stability for partners. And I hope that covers it, but I think that's kind of the gist of it.
Max, just since you've been on the other side of the table in a lot of these conversations, what are some of the best questions that you get asked as someone that provides such a robust integration offering? Where do you see people really seeing the light bulb click when they ask the right question?
It's a good question. Let me think about it.
I'm going to take notes on what I should ask. So make sure I'm
Right.
really thoughtful on what was the best one.
One of the best questions we'll get asked is sort of how we started this conversation around what level of integration are you offering? Is this a first party, a third party integration, and how can that be supplemented, if at all, by an API? I also think asking if you aren't already able to see any documentation on the integration is an extremely important question to ask. So what documentation, if any, is available about your API or about the integration, so you can do your own reading and research about what is possible with the integration, and not just take a salesperson's word for it or something like that, who may not have the level of technical expertise that is actually required for the integration. And then, I mean, one of the sort of going off of the documentation question, another question I would ask is just about any other testimonials or reviews or experiences that the company has had doing a similar integration in the past. Sometimes companies can be a little bit more ambitious about what they say is possible with the integration than what is actually possible. So having someone or being able to speak with someone who has gone through a successful integration between two systems is a great resource. Yeah, those would probably be the three I could highlight. I'll think of any others, but.
And I think a good one that Jeff pointed to earlier, which is just, sure, it's great to understand if it's native or custom or through a third party or an API, but it's almost like that's just the first order question. And second order is, even if it is custom, what is the actual data being produced? Like that doesn't tell you the full story. That leads us nicely to, as you're thinking about integrations in the broader tech decision picture of assessing, and you mentioned this at the beginning, Max, but assessing the value of having an all-in-one solution versus being able to pick your point solutions. I feel like all three of you will probably have a good perspective on this. So Matt, I don't know if you want to kick us off and then we can move around.
Yeah, I would say, in my experience, what I would typically look at is really what you're using that functionality for. Is it going to be kind of a critical or core part of your organization, your business, and then making sure that it's ultimately going to do what you want it to do, not just in the short term, but in the long term, hopefully as well. Trying to understand, the health or the, how robust and mature the company is, or the offering that you're looking at. And just making sure that you're really assessing, is this going to work for us in the near term, in the long term, or are we going to have to move away from it because it's ultimately not going to give us the ability to add additional features and functionality that kind of go along with that, if that makes sense.
Jeff, I don't know if you have a perspective on this.
Sure. So when thinking of these all-in-one solutions or adding additional point solutions in, one of the biggest things that we have to ask ourselves is the significance of the business problem we're trying to solve. A lot of times, some of the areas that a particular solution falls short aren't actually core. They're nice to haves, they're not requirements. And so being really clear on what our requirements are, being really clear about what's core to our primary goals for approaching this, and then making sure that we're not getting swayed by bells and whistles that may be interesting at some point in the future, but actually don't speak to what we need. And that would, of course, speak more to the all-in-one solution and living within that rather than just adding additional point solutions
Sure.
as we go.
No, I think that makes sense. And it points to the need to assess your own needs currently and longer term before you start engaging with a vendor or a product, right? Because they're going to have lots of bells and whistles that can all of a sudden start to seem critical, but you sort of need to have your North Star to go back to make sure you're making the right decisions.
And I can say one additional point, as you said that, Mitch, that came to mind, where we've gotten it wrong before in evaluating partners or thinking about this is when we were using a point solution for a particular business need and it was core to what we needed, but it actually wasn't core to the third party's future product roadmap. And so we found that when we added it, it was great the first few months and even the first year we had it, but they quickly diverged to focusing on product development in different areas and we were left behind in what we needed. So that was something that was a big lesson for us, is to also understand the future. And I think Matt mentioned this, right? Like thinking about the future of where the company's headed and making sure it's aligned with what your goals are for the particular solution you're deploying.
I would build off of that. One of the questions that I would ask, going back to the questions question, is just about what does the product roadmap look like, and what is what is on the horizon? Because I think Matt, you mentioned this too about updates and ongoing maintenance. It's certainly something that you're relying on when you opt into a first party integration, is that it's not really in your control what this is true for any tech product, but you don't really control that ongoing maintenance component, the improvements to the integration. Frequently there's versioning that happens with an API, so that can fall behind pretty quickly if one company is updating their API to match the latest and greatest for a service, but then the other company is not updating the integration. So learning about when was this last updated and how committed is the company to ongoing improvements to the integration are really important things to understand. And then if I could just build on the question you asked, Mitch, about sort of thinking about the all-in-one versus a best-in-class. I'm a big believer in best-in-class software. If you have a company that's focused on a specific aspect of whether that's fundraising, email marketing, donor engagement, stewardship, whatever that area is, and having someone who's fully dedicated to improving that specific area, you're generally going to get better results than a company that's focused broadly. But what you may lose is the cohesiveness of the data. So when I think about this problem, especially as it applies to nonprofits, a lot of that has to start with what is your CRM, because the CRM is the source of truth for your organization. That's where all the data is held. And then you're asking, okay, well, can it integrate here to there, and those sort of spokes from your CRM, and how do those talk to each other? But the CRM is where it starts. And so I think this conversation has to really think in the context of if you're starting from scratch, the CRM conversation is where that integration conversation needs to start. Is what is that philosophy of that CRM and their ability to integrate with other vendors? Because if that is a closed ecosystem, it's going to make it really hard for you to work with best-in-class tools. If it's a more open ecosystem and they do offer those integrations as a philosophy of the CRM, and you see that happening, it will open your options for things that you may not know you need to start. Once you have the CRM, then it becomes a bit of a different. That's sort of where I would start and put that as sort of like we're establishing this relationship, and then you look at other integration relationships that you could have. But it really requires the CRM, because it's not like every tool is just building a web of connections. It's really one connection that goes to a bunch of different tools and brings it back and forth. So I really think that's a fundamental consideration for any nonprofit when looking at integrations, the CRM relationship to other tools.
Yeah, and I think the CRM, often those providers are the ones that are trying hardest to be the all-in-one solution. And so that's where those two decision points really intersect, of understanding what's core, and if their functionality meets that core need well, or they have the option to use something externally. So I think that all ties into that core decision.
What's interesting about that is I find that the CRMs that are winning, can I say names? Like I feel like a lot of the CRMs that are really winning in the for-profit enterprise world are Salesforce and HubSpot, with very open integration ecosystems. And in the enterprise, you have Blackbot in a very closed, difficult to integrate with ecosystem. And so I do feel that there's going to be a bit of a reckoning with the more open ecosystems winning out. You have more competition. It opens up, it provides more consumer choice for the users of the CRM to integrate with more tools. And so I think the CRMs that are providing open ecosystems will win out, or the biggest players, the Blackbots, will have to open up more. Because right now, as a fundraising tech CEO who would love to integrate easily with Blackbot, it is not easy or even possible to do so. So being in that ecosystem immediately makes it more difficult for a nonprofit to integrate with other best-in-class tools at no fault of their own. That's just, they're locked into this world of in-house software, which makes it harder to integrate with. It's still possible, but it's more manual. It's not automated.
Yeah, and I mean, Jeff knows this firsthand, but what you brought up earlier around making sure it covers your core needs, Blackbot extends beyond CRM and fundraising for so many organizations, particularly in like the higher ed space. So it's like, when do you know if it's worth breaking apart your like student enrollment management from your core CRM? That's a really hard decision. And if those other, possible integrations aren't core, that's really hard to weigh.
Yeah, we've gone on that journey at the center from Blackbaud to Salesforce, from a closed, walled-off garden to sort of open and whatever's possible is possible. When each has its own challenges and its own benefits, don't get me wrong. There's no, there's right answers for lots of different organizations, but I tend to agree with Max. Like, the future seems to be in the much more open space, and I've seen the challenges for companies, not just Blackbaud and others like them, who run CRMs that are closed off, where their philosophy has been to either offer what they offer and expand upon that by buying up and bolting on solutions that you also then buy from them, where there's no real integration, there's no real API to speak of. There may be lip service to it. There may be like, oh yes, we have an API, but the API actually only opens up one field on one record and it doesn't do much, right? It's just a sales tactic. So it's important really to understand exactly what companies are offering and do that due diligence and ask those tough questions.
No, that all makes total sense. And maybe we can, talking about tough questions, I think one thing, for better or for worse, the nonprofits are going to be focused on is cost. And I think integrations are a common area where the costs can be a little bit buried. They're outside of the core offering. And so all of a sudden you start tacking on a lot of integration costs. So I don't know if you have thoughts, Max, maybe to start on where those costs can be hidden, how you can make sure you're revealing them all, and like what cost is okay, like what cost should they not be afraid of paying because of the value.
In terms of cost, there's sort of three considerations, and it's going back to the third party, first party API conversation, because I really think those are sort of the three buckets you're considering when looking at an integration. The first is with Zapier. In third party integrations, there's typically a cost to use Zapier itself. So it may be advertised as free. You integrate with Zapier for free, but you're going to have a price point based on the usage of that tool. It has a free tier to start, but once you get over like 100 data transfers a month or something like that, you're going to start having to pay for Zapier. Some tools will also charge for the use of Zapier, so you're actually paying two charges, or even three, if both to integrate on both sides, and then Zapier itself. So understanding that cost structure is very important if you're relying on a third-party tool to integrate. Sometimes platforms will charge a first-party integration fee. If you're on like the Salesforce App Exchange, there may be a fee just to purchase that app or that integration. And if you're not, then there may be a charge just for use of the integration. And that should be a little bit more clear and explicit. The last one is for use of the API. Some companies will charge an API access fee. So they may offer an API, but it's actually not public, free, or accessible at all unless you're paying for it. So understanding those sort of three layers, what is the integration and what does it cost in those different buckets, it's hopefully helpful.
Yeah, I think just laying out the possible cost areas just so people can kind of go through and check the boxes is really helpful, because everyone presents it differently, to your point. So that's super helpful. And I think it leads into the broader conversation around cost and how to make the trade-off and assessment of those costs. And I know, Matt, you've done a lot of work around cost benefit analysis and build versus buy. Maybe just walk us through a little bit about how you think about return on investment costs in technology.
Yeah, I've definitely spent a lot of time looking into the buy versus build. I think one thing that I always do is try to make sure that you understand. I think I mentioned this earlier. How core to your business is this functionality that you're trying to add? Is it something that is low risk? Like a lot of the times for basic stuff, it's completely acceptable risk to relying on third party for it, especially when it comes to areas that may not be your area of expertise or your core competency for your organization. Does it really make sense to try to build it yourself when there's a lot of really great options out in the market? I think that we're lucky in this day and age. There's such a robust ecosystem for different APIs and services out there. So when you do the evaluation, just try to make sure, what is your plan B? If you do go with an offering from an organization, do you have alternatives? And again, going back to just, is this something that's really critical or core to our our business, and should we really think about trying to build it ourselves? There's costs associated with that. There's opportunity costs associated with that. What else could you be focused on if you weren't trying to build something yourself? And so you just have to really find the right balance between what makes sense based on what you're trying to accomplish.
The opportunity cost is a big one, and also just cost and time. So these things that are not like direct dollar costs. I guess, Jeff, do you kind of have a framework that you use at the center when you're evaluating things beyond price in terms of people, in terms of what you're giving up? I'd be curious to hear.
Before I forget, the one addition to Max's list of things to evaluate is the license type that you have. And if you need to upgrade your type of license when evaluating like all the ways that you could wind up paying more for integrations. That's one that we've stumbled upon. But to your direct question, in evaluating the return on investment, and especially from a non-financial perspective, and thinking about staff time and thinking about just the opportunity cost of building versus buying, we've gone down the road a number of times and found that for the type of organization we're a 37-year-old community center whose infrastructure has been built up to manage our building, not to manage our tech. So we do not have developers on staff. We don't have a significant tech staff to speak of. We finally added our second IT person around 6 months, a year ago now. So just to give you a sense of who we are as an organization, that means we're often buying, and we will often land on that. We'll ask ourselves the question, we'll go through it, but there's just not the internal capacity to take on ongoing maintenance. And so we will look for whatever we can to buy off the shelf and customize as much as we can. And if it gets us like 80% of the way there, that's likely good enough, because to get 100% of the way there would just mean ongoing costs to increase the capacity of the organization to maintain and develop it that aren't reasonable for us or in our sort of strategic roadmap.
I was just going to go a little bit further, even beyond the build versus buy question of like assess, even when you are buying something, assessing the non-monetary costs for you as an organization, either in terms of opportunity costs or staff time. Like, I don't know if there's any, you can't predict the future, but is there a way for people to try to get a grip on how much of their own organization's time will be taken versus the return on using that technology?
Don't do what I do, which is always underestimate the amount of time it'll take. So always overestimate, even when you're buying something that you think is going to be off the shelf. It takes a lot of time to integrate it, to do the right change management and culture change, to get an organization to adopt it, to make it part of how business is done. Even if it seems beautiful and intuitive and easy to use, there's still a lot of time and attention that needs to get taken. So I think it's overestimate that and assume it's going to take a lot of time, including leadership and staff, like technical time to roll it out.
Yeah, and one thing I've heard of too from a number of organizations is the need to make that time a part of what you're asking for from your staff. So I think what generates a lot of frustration is like getting up to speed on certain tools is just in their free time. And so if it's the expectation that you have to, like, I'm setting aside your time and the organization's time to do this, maybe that alleviates some of the like reluctancy to really like adopt and adapt new tools.
I think it does. I think building it in as much as you can to the workday is critical. It shouldn't be outside of work time. The other thing, and this is more to change management than it is to evaluation, but it's worked well for us, so I'll share it. When we're integrating a new tool that we've acquired, or that, in the rare times we've built it, we make sure and mark it as a celebration. We mark the occasion and celebrate with staff so that it's something that's actually fun. We get a cake, we like have some sort of opportunity that, food goes a long way, especially sweets. We make sure that there's something to celebrate about it, not just like, great, here's a whole bunch of new work for you. And so we'll try and do that. We'll also make sure and go out of our way to be really, really open to feedback, so that folks feel comfortable and don't feel scared to say, this isn't working for me, or I don't get it, or this isn't exactly right. Because otherwise they'll just suffer in silence and we'll never know until like 6 months later.
I love that. I mean, everyone can use more snack breaks. Are you going to start like Postmating cake to people to do virtual.
We've thought about it.
We should start sending people cakes when they buy Give Butter. That's what we should do.
We had somebody in our office set up, I can't remember the name of the company, but you essentially create the account, and for each person in your organization can go on and sign up for the specific types of candy they want delivered to their house. And it was meant to be an alternative to the snack room snacks. So everybody got to customize whatever sweets they wanted delivered to their house. It was a pretty nice idea. Worked pretty well.
All right, Matt, all of a sudden that's the main takeaway from this conversation. So you're going to have to look up the name and put it in the comment.
I will see if I can find it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, maybe one more question, which is along the lines of what we're talking about, but not individual tech, but maybe you've been using a tool, it's old or it doesn't integrate with the things that you want it to. What is the final straw? And like, I hear this all the time that people are just sitting and waiting in system. It keeps falling to the bottom of their priority list or to-do list, and it does an okay job, and they're just like aren't ready to make the change. And this is open for all three of you, do you have, when have you seen people like reach the breaking point, and what's like better breaking point? And maybe we can develop a bit of a framework to make that decision.
Like for us, it's been easy. It's budget is the primary one. And so we have a plan of like the budget we plan to spend on in this area. Though recently I would say security breaches are a major topic of conversation, and we'll reshuffle the deck quickly when they occur. And I've seen a number of organizations reconsidering what they're willing to tolerate due to security breaches.
A frequent straw that's breaking the camel's back right now, in all seriousness, has been COVID. I think it's been a big wake-up call for organizations where you have, especially when your only experience and engagement with your donor is online, it's just that much more important that that's done at a really high level and done well. And nonprofits as a traditionally risk-averse industry, and understandably so, I think are experiencing a time when there is no playbook and there is a risk in taking no risks. And so it kind of, if anything, has sort of freed up organizations who maybe were considering a change for a long time to say maybe now's the time, and to think a little bit longer term if they're able to. But that varies, and every organization's in a different spot. But I think that the time we're in now has been sort of a time for that to be reevaluated and reconsidered from the ground up in a way that's never really, otherwise wouldn't have really been there. There was no impetus to reevaluate and look at those things. So
I can say from my side, the biggest driver has always been major service outages. Those are some of the ones that have bit us the most just throughout my career. That's always a major pain point. It goes back to some of the earlier discussions about, risk. Is the service going to be reliable? That's been a big problem. And then, you kind of at that point, have to figure out, I guess, Mitch, your question about, when do you pull the trigger and when you make a switch, you just have to do the assessment about, how much time is it going to save you in the long run versus the short run? Are the pain points worth living with, or is it worth just putting in the effort, making a switch? That can be difficult, especially if a system or an integration is wound up touching a lot of your different systems or the workflows for people and things like that. It can be painful, but sometimes it's definitely worth it if you feel, in the medium to long run that you will end up saving time. I would say that definitely something to think about.
Jeff, do you feel like it's best practices to have some type of like annual or quarterly, I don't know what the right cadence is, but some type of like tech review where you sort of check in and that might help you make some of those critical decisions sooner?
Yes, we do an annual staff survey. That's one way we do that, about technology needs and how the different systems we have are working for folks. I think it's important to do that to surface issues that have emerged that you're not aware of, and also just to periodically review and do a sort of deeper dive with what systems you've got and how they've evolved or haven't as the organization has. And that's feeling more and more true, to Max's point, during COVID and all the ways it's required us to pivot and adapt. The systems that are lagging behind have become, I think, more and more obvious.
Yeah, and I think that also, your point about the survey is great. It needs to be data driven, right? So don't let just the fear of change or aversion to trying something new. Like really, I think if you have that cadence, and you can hold yourself accountable to data outcomes, whether it's a staff survey or other KPIs related to your own systems.
To Jeff's previous comment about when there's like a time to reevaluate, or the straw that might break the camel's back on an integration, keeping a close eye on contracts and contract renewals, I think is really important. As you think about evaluating other tools, frequently you have that moment, whatever that is, that you're like fed up, your accounting data is not reconciling, whatever that is that's causing this, I need to reevaluate a new vendor. But then little do you know, you're in a 3-year agreement that's only on year 2. You have to wait another year or so on to even start a new contract. So I think that's a really important consideration, is keeping a close eye on those contracts, the contract terms, the lengths, and when those renewals happen, because that, maybe 3 months prior, 6 months prior is really probably the best time to start doing a serious search so that you're ready to cleanly jump into a new system without being locked into a contract. And even considering there's a lot of vendors now who won't lock you into a contract from the beginning. They'll actually go month to month, or maybe even be free to start and have a trial period. So that's definitely something to look at from a cost perspective, if that's an option available to you.
I was going to say, on the timing part, it's incredibly true. I think the other piece in contract provisions is the notification window you've got. So it may expire at the end of August, but you have to give 60 days notice before expiration, otherwise it automatically renews. So we've found that one out. The other piece, though, is the internal timing of the organization and what the system is you're talking about changing, because it may be that the contract expires in May, because that's when you originally signed it, but to support your largest event, which is in September. And so you can't switch in the middle of that, and you've got to time those windows the right way, so that you don't wind up with an interruption in service to drive the business.
It sounds like a feature we should be including in someone's Empower Us profile, to be able to mark when their contracts expire on their current products to spur a new search. So that's a good one.
That's Max. A great idea. Yeah, little notification reminders. All right, I'll see if I can squeeze this in between this very loud Hawk. I hope you guys it's not bothering anyone. But the one thing I wanted to just add that I feel like it's really important in the integration conversation is not just a build versus buy question, but an automate versus manual process question. Because you can work with a tool, and if you actually consider all the lift involved with automating, bringing this data into my CRM, there's a lot of times you can do that manually with a high level of customization with an import export, in a way that might even be more time saving and lower cost over if you factor in all the variables there. So I think that integrating is great if it can be done in a cost-effective and seamless way. But when you add all this complication, depending on what you're integrating, and big caveats here across the board, but there's a lot of times, especially as a tech founder and CEO, we also consider there's this idea, especially in startup land, of doing things that don't scale, and that being almost like a badge of honor. Is like when you start off, sometimes you just got to do things that don't scale, that are super manual. You're personally handwriting every thank you note, whatever that is. And over time, you hire someone and you automate things away. But when you're starting off with 2 new tools or something, if there's a way to start off that relationship in a manual way, and then as you build up reasons for automating it, I think that there's a time and place where that can come more into play. So I definitely want to throw that out there as a consideration. It's just the idea of doing a manual integration versus an automated integration. Still possible.
Yeah, it's like a precursor to the cost question, right? Because it's like before you can even evaluate the cost, you need to know the need within that system. And so you kind of need to identify your breaking points where it's valuable and worth the investment, because most integrations, as we're learning, carry at least some additional cost over the base product.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, this has been incredibly informative for me on the integration and the food delivery front. So I appreciate everyone's insights and input. And, we just have a ton of valuable tips for people in here. So I'm looking forward to taking this one back and sharing.
Yeah. Thank you, Mitch.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks, Mitch.
Nice to meet you guys. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
You as well. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion. Be sure to join Empower Us for more resources and one-on-one help in finding the tech solutions you need. If you have any feedback or suggestions, you can email us at info@empowerus.org. Thank you.